Welcome to the Next Set podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Rehan Tahir. This show is going to be about everyday humans who want to train with purpose and perform better in real life. We'll break down strength and conditioning, exercise and fitness, along with mindset with coaches who live it. So let's get started. Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of the Next Set podcast. Today we're going to be talking about GLP type medications, your Wegovy's, your Ozempics, your Zepbounds, your Mounjaros. Retatrutide is another one that's coming out that's in clinical trials still. Are they cheating? Someone had posted a few weeks ago that from their perspective, I think they implied that using these types of medications amounts to cheating. And so is this truly a shortcut when you take these types of medications? Well, let's talk about it. Let's talk about a little bit of the science behind fat loss and hunger and satiety and what that means and how these types of medications fit in. And at the end, let's talk about a framework. Whether or not you choose to use these medications, I think the important takeaway from this episode today is going to be what kind of framework are you going to put in place regardless of whether you put these types of medications to use or not. So in essence, I think most people, at least nowadays with the information available to us, I think a lot of people are starting to understand, or they have been educated, that to some degree or to the majority of the degree, weight loss is calories in, calories out, energy balance, caloric deficit. In order for you to lose weight effectively, you need to basically burn more than you consume, in essence, right? And technically that's true. I think that is still the primary driver behind weight loss for the majority of people. The question is really trying to figure out a balance depending upon the individual about what that energy balance is for that individual, and it's unique. There are equations out there. Those equations are estimates, and sometimes they need to be modified, or factors need to be taken into consideration depending upon the person. So energy balance determines basically whether fat is stored or is lost. And if it was only math, it wouldn't necessarily be that hard, right? Math is exact in a lot of cases. I mean, I'm not a mathematician, but for the most part, I think most of us agree that math is pretty standard in terms of quantitative and kind of an exact objective measure that we can go by. But sometimes that's not always the case, right? Especially when you're trying to lose weight and your body is fighting you back or not getting the kind of results that you're hoping to see, even though you feel like you're doing everything right. So let's think about it this way. Your body, much like a thermostat in your house, when you have a thermostat in the house, there's this set point. You set it. You like a certain temperature to be comfortable for yourself, right? Whether that's 72, or in my house, it's usually like 67 or 68. People run hot around here. Whatever that set point is for you, you usually set your furnace or your air conditioning to balance that temperature throughout the day. If it's a little cooler, you want a little warmer. If it's a little too hot, you want the AC to kick on. And so that thermostat helps to balance that temperature, right? Your body has a similar system, and it's called the adipostat theory, and I would say quotes around that theory, where your body fat drops and your body kicks in several complex systems, whether that's adjusting hormones or peptides or neurotransmitters from the brain into regulation of hunger, right? And really that is the body's mechanism to maintain homeostasis, stability. That is how your body wants to regulate fat mass, how it wants to regulate other types of important systems that your body's basically trying to maintain life. It's a survival mechanism. And so whether or not this exact set, quote unquote, set point theory exists or not in the human body, I think there's still some debate about it. I haven't looked at the exact latest research about it. I think to some degree, I think we can agree that fat loss, and when you're trying to lose weight and when you're trying to cut calories and eat in a way that triggers weight loss, your body is going to try to maintain homeostasis, and there's going to be a biological feedback mechanism involved through several systems. Typically those systems, they operate through three types of components. So you can think about receptors, integrators, and effectors. So let's walk through that. Think of it this way. Receptors are the sensors. They detect changes. And so a lot of these medications that we're seeing are called receptor agonists, meaning they elicit a response, or they elicit a signal to these types of receptors that are waiting to hear from them. So when these receptors detect the changes, for example, it could be low blood glucose, it could be a stomach stretch, which we'll talk about when you eat, changes in fat mass, whatever those changes are, those receptors detect it, and through a series of signals, they then basically get sent to what are called integrators, and integrators process that information. And we'll talk a little bit about the primary integrator that processes a lot of that information, which is in the brain. With weight regulation, that's the hypothalamus, and so we'll go into that a little bit. And then you have the effectors. So you have the receptors that detect the signal, the integrators that process this information and try to figure out how to handle it. And then you have the effectors. The effectors execute the response. For example, they might release hormones. Your nervous system might be adjusted in terms of sympathetic or parasympathetic response. Hunger levels may change. Your energy expenditure may go up or down. Your behavior may change. How you interact with your surroundings might change based on those effectors. And so, for example, if body fat levels start to drop, your receptors then will detect that change. The hypothalamus, which is in the brain, will interpret that, right? For example, effectors might adjust your appetite through several mechanisms, or your metabolism. And so that's the overall system. Signal, processing that signal and determining how to respond to it, and then initiating that actual response, and then the body reacts, right? So let's break it down a little bit. There's three main areas that I want to talk about. The brain, because a lot of this starts in the brain with receptors in the brain, but also the hypothalamus. And so we'll spend a few minutes talking about that. Then we'll talk about the gut. The gut has also some receptors that need to be talked about. And then we'll talk about adipose tissue, which is another place where an important receptor lives, which is called leptin. So we'll go into that as well. And so with these three major components, and I'm sure I'm missing something, but I think these are the main ones that will cover what we're trying to talk about today. That's kind of how this system works. So we're going to talk about those. We're going to put them in relationship to hunger and how your hunger levels might be influenced by your diet, how these medications might help, impact some of that, and then what the framework is. So that's kind of the topics for today, right? So we mentioned the hypothalamus. That is the primary integrator of energy balance. So it receives signals from the gut, which we'll talk about. It receives signals from adipose tissue. You might receive signals from blood glucose levels, the hormones, insulin, leptin. So it's comparing all of those different inputs to what your baseline is. Like again, we talked about set point. We talked about homeostasis. And so your body's comparing this information and constantly trying to assess what are we going to move to help keep that balance in place, right? So if energy stores, i.e. fat storage, looks threatened, or blood glucose is threatened, then the body will kick in a response. So let's simplify this into maybe a relatable analogy. Let's call it a gas pedal and a brake. You have the gas, which are termed orexigenic signals. And so these are the strong appetite stimulating type of signals. Excuse me. And then you have the anorexigenic signals, which is the brake. And we'll talk about the differences of those different ones. So first, let's talk about the gas pedal, orexigenic signals. And one of the strongest hunger signals that you're going to get, there's a compound, a peptide called neuropeptide Y. And this is actually one of the most prominent neuropeptides in the brain, maybe the body. I have to check that, but it's definitely abundant. And so this really does help drive appetite. This is one of those gas pedal type of hormones, right? It also influences carbohydrate intake. It can reduce energy expenditure in the body. And this peptide also rises during times of dieting or fasting or weight loss. So when you're eating less and you're trying to stay on a routine, this is one of those hormones that kicks in, or these peptides that kick in your body that says, "Hey, hold on, something's happening here. We need to ramp up a little bit. He's not eating enough, or she's not eating enough. We need to increase that appetite to make sure that they're eating appropriately, so we don't lose our fat stores, right?" And so when someone starts to restrict those calories, that's when some of that hunger cues come in. How you respond to that is another question, but some people will advocate that it's all willpower and you just need to get used to that, and I think to some degree that's true, right? Hunger is not a negative thing, and I think learning how to be comfortable with hunger is important, even if you're taking a medication that helps to suppress that. We'll get into that, but there has to be a level of balance with having a feeling of hunger, but not letting it get out of control, but dealing and managing that hunger. So you're learning how to live kind of with that feeling, right? And sometimes that becomes challenging. So that's the neuropeptide Y. Another signal from the brain is called a Goody gene-related protein. I think I'm pronouncing that right. I don't know. I'm going to mispronounce stuff, folks. You're just going to have to forgive me. This also works alongside neuropeptide Y and increases food intake, particularly high-fat foods. So that becomes a challenge because high-fat foods are very calorically dense. They're usually more prominently stored as fat, especially in an abundance of calories. And so there's really not a lot of, value in having a lot of excess fat from my perspective. I mean, I know that ketogenic diets are very popular, they're very high-fat, but in terms of caloric balance and in terms of the thermic effect of food, in terms of how your body uses some of these calories, it's kind of a higher risk type of calorie intake. So that's where this agouti gene-related protein also influences that, right? So you feel like you want to increase your food intake, and then you start to crave these higher fat foods. And then you have ghrelin, which is secreted from the stomach, but it actually interacts with the brain. So we're still kind of on that brain topic. And this really peaks before meals, right before meals, especially if you have this meal timing in place where you're eating consistent foods, which we'll talk about that, and I want to advocate for that because that does help kind of keep a structure in place. But the ghrelin senses that, hey, it's time to eat, and it starts to secrete in your stomach. It also rises during caloric restriction, right? And so it's also responsible for stimulating hunger. So now think about it. You're on a caloric restriction. You're following your diet, and your diet is, you think it's good. And then you start to battle these hunger cues. It's coming from the neuropeptide Y. It's coming from the agouti gene-related protein. It's coming from the ghrelin now that's being stimulated in your stomach because it's empty and because you're fasting, you're dieting. And so now you've got these strong hunger cues that are screaming at your body to, hey, we got to get back to homeostasis. This is crazy. Eat something, right? All of these are part of those orexigenic signals. All of these are part of that gas pedal of increasing appetite so you can start to consume food because your body is going into kind of like a safety mode, right? I guess there's a way to think about it. Now let's talk about the other side, the anorexigenic signals, which are basically the brake, the satiety pathways. And the hypothalamus also contributes to activating several of these. One of these is pro-opiomelanocortin, which suppresses appetite, POMC, I think I'd call it. And when this pathway is active, appetite goes down, food intake drops. Serotonin is another neurochemical which is important, which can also reduce eating rate, eating in terms of how much you're eating, how fast you're eating, meal size. There's also signals that happen, cholecystokinin and peptide YY, that contribute to satiety. But here's the key. When you're doing prolonged caloric restriction dieting, these satiety pathways can start to weaken, right? There's this negative response that happens where they start to diminish, they start to weaken, and the gas pedal becomes much stronger. So that balance is now disrupted, right? Your body is really trying to balance that all, and that's the adaptation of dieting and restricting calories. Then we got to talk about the reward layer, the limbic system. Your body, I think we all agree that sometimes eating food, and especially when there's community involved, people involved, you're eating highly palatable foods, delicious foods, what you're seeing, what you're smelling, what you're tasting, all of those memory cues come into play, right? And so you start to think about, hey, I remember this tastes good. I'm expecting a reward now, right? And so not only do I have to deal in a caloric deficit with the hunger cues and these hormones and these peptides that are kicking in, and now my brake pedal is much weaker. Now I've got to fight my reward system too, where I want to get this dopamine fix, right, from these highly palatable foods. Combinations of fat and sugar, things that are basically empty calories that don't provide a lot of nutritive value, these all activate the dopamine pathways, right? And that creates the reward. Even if you're not hungry, sometimes those things can kick in. It's a stimulating effect. You're basically overstimulated. And sometimes that reward is strong enough, or very strong in some individuals, that overrides that homeostatic regulation. So that is kind of the brain in a nutshell. Again, I'm sure I missed some, so I open it up to anybody who's an expert in this field to please do weigh in, jump in, start the conversation, add to or correct what I'm saying. As long as we're being respectful, I think that we would welcome crowdsourcing education here. But that, from my perspective and my understanding, that's the brain aspect of that hunger pathway. Now let's talk about the gut, the digestive system. And so you have receptors in your digestive system that will detect nutrient presence. There's a mechanical stretch involved when you eat your food and your stomach fills, right? And so that can also send signals, right? Basically getting those receptors to engage and then having your brain trying to interpret what to do with that. Hormonal signals, right? And so when you eat, for example, your stomach expands. And those stretch receptors send signals through the vagus nerve to the brain. And that's one of the earliest fullness signals. So volume is important. When you're eating foods that are a lot of fiber, they might be lower calorie on that sense, but they have a lot of bulk, a lot of volume, and that helps to activate that stretch response. Eating slower as well, because when you eat slower, that gives time for your stomach to fill without over-consuming calories. And so some of those strategies that we'll talk about, but that's how you basically can trigger that response, and that triggers a sense of fullness, right? That distension strengthens fullness and strengthens signaling. What I do want to point out is that in some individuals, especially people who are used to chronic overeating, that stretch signal could be much different than someone who has a smaller stomach, because their stomach is larger. It's used to being stretched more frequently and maybe does not relax to the same size that others might. I think there's also evidence in some of the literature that I've seen that even their small intestines might be longer. And so what that might mean is that it takes longer for them to get some of those satiety signals to kick in from some of these hormonal signals as well. So that's something to think about, as if you are in a state of being overweight or obese, you have kind of 3 or 4 steps ahead that you have to think about in terms of what everyone else might deal with when they're just trying to lose a few pounds. And so you have to think about different strategies that might work for you a little differently. Then there's some gut hormones that we have to think about. Cholecystokinin is released when fat enters the small intestine, so that slows gastric emptying, that suppresses hunger signals in the brain. Peptide YY is released further down in the intestine, contributes to the meal termination, so it basically signals you to, hey, it's time to stop eating now. Insulin's a big one. I'm sure we're going to hear about that quite a bit, and I'm sure there's people that have a lot of opinions about insulin, but that rises after you eat, right? And that also does send some signals to the brain to say, hey, we have enough glucose in here. Let's turn off a little bit, right? Eating quickly can outpace a lot of these signals that we just spoke about in the gut. So when you eat very quickly, you're filling your stomach very fast. It takes time for these hormones to catch up. And so it's kind of like this rebound, this boomerang effect, where you're eating, and then you've stuffed your stomach with a lot of calories, and then a few minutes or sometime after that, then these peptides and these hormones and these different types of responses that kind of trigger the break, they haven't had enough time to react, and so it's slower. And so that gives you more time to eat because you're not getting that signal that says, hey, we're full, we've had enough, right? And so you kind of overshoot. And so that's another strategy that we need to mention when we recap, is how to try to eat slower to maintain that and give your body a chance to get those hunger signals in place, right? Let's talk about the last system here really in terms of these hormones and these receptors, and that's adipose tissue, right? And that's a place that a lot of us underestimate, because fat tissue isn't just storage. It's also an endocrine organ, and so that has receptors that sense the energy storage. Remember, it's kind of sending off those receptors that signals to the integrator to say, what do we do? Oh no, we're losing fat. Fat storage is going down, and so these hormones get secreted. The most important of which is leptin, and I think most of you may have come across at one point or another, what leptin is, and that signals to the hypothalamus how much fat is stored, right? And so when fat mass is higher, leptin is higher, right? And that activates satiety pathways, basically saying, hey, all is good. We've got plenty of fat storage, good to go, right? The coffers are good, we're good. We don't need you to reduce anything or trigger anything to help release the fat. We're okay, so no need to add more. Leptin also suppresses neuropeptide Y, and a Agouti gene-related protein, so it acts on those brain chemicals, right? Which also helps trigger a reduction in appetite. And so when you lose fat, this is the key, when you start to lose fat and the body fat storage goes down, then leptin says, hey, hang on, wait a minute, we're losing fat, we're losing our fat stores. we might need to get some more food in here to help top us up. And so those receptors detect that drop, the hypothalamus integrates that, and then you have the effectors which act on several of the mechanisms that we just discussed to increase hunger and then also reduce energy expenditure through the sympathetic nervous system. And so you have all of these different major systems that your body is constantly trying to figure out, right, and try to fight against. And so it almost seems like a losing battle, right, unless you have that structure in place, especially if you're obese. And so that's basically, in essence, the adipostat theory and how it defends fat mass. And so, that's, I think, a big one. Also, lipoprotein lipase, I didn't mention that, but that's another enzyme in fat tissue that typically helps to clear triglycerides from the bloodstream into fat cells. And so when you're dieting, that lipoprotein lipase, activity increases. And so when you start to eat normally after a period of dieting, your body fat storage is actually primed, right? That efficiency in how your body fat is stored is actually increased. And so that also can lead to some vulnerability in regaining that fat mass. And so when you see people that, diet and they lose a lot of weight and then they kind of go back to their old ways and their old diet, and then they end up gaining as much or more body fat than they had before. And so that could be one of the mechanisms at play, aside from just, general overconsumption of calories, trying to combat all these hunger signals that come rushing back. So, fat loss isn't just shrinking the cells, it's modifying this whole signaling network. And so, again, it could be an uphill battle, a very, very difficult battle for some people who struggle with the hormones, with the sheer amount of weight to lose. And sometimes that could be a mental mountain to climb for a lot of people. But then there's also that reward system that we talked about with the limbic system. And so when we talk about GLP type medications, right, we can talk about that framework. And so GLP-1 is a receptor agonist that works within the same receptor integrator effector system, right? They bind to the GLP receptors in the brain, in the gut. These increase satiety signaling. They slow gastric emptying, which is a big part of it as well. And ultimately, they reduce appetite for most people, right? They could also improve glucose-dependent insulin secretion. So they amplify a lot of the braking mechanisms that we talked about earlier. And so that is important because when you're restricting calories, right, and you're fighting that gas pedal, these medications can come into play and start to apply a little bit more brake pressure to take a little bit of that pressure off, to say, well, I'm dieting and I'm in a caloric restriction, hopefully, but I'm not really that hungry, because the medication is helping to take off that pressure on your braking system, right? The anorexigenic pathways. Then you have the dual agonists. So we talked about GLP-1, and then there's drugs like tirzepatide, which I think would be Zepbound, Mounjaro, and they basically work on two receptor agonists. And so they also activate the glucose-dependent insulinotropic polypeptide receptors. And so that is something that basically additionally helps with hunger cues and also with some of that fat storage. In fact, I think that second agonist works even better hand in hand with the GLP-1. And so I think by itself, I've read that it's not that effective, but together combined with those two. So I do want to stress too, I'm not a medical doctor. I'm not a pharmacist or a pharmacologist. And so take this information with a grain of salt in terms of the in-depth component of these medications. That's not the point of this podcast. You can watch plenty of videos on YouTube or read something about them online. This is basically some high-level information from the research, so I want to point that out. Do your own research when it comes to a little bit more in-depth knowledge on these. I want to just provide some context to how these might interact with our hunger and our satiety before I move on to the final phase, which is how we can work naturally to combat some of this. There's also a new drug coming out. It's called retatrutide, or I call it retatrutide. Excuse me. Again, I'm probably mispronouncing it, but I think retatrutide is how you pronounce it. And that's a triple agonist. So it's actually working on 3 receptors. So remember, it's helping to initiate some responses to the body, so the body can basically integrate these signals to say everything's okay. We don't have to do anything. We don't have to trigger a hunger response. And so kind of dampening down that gas pedal. And they work through influencing energy expenditure as well. This triple agonist retatrutide, I think, also not only works on the two receptors that the semaglutide and the tirzepatide works on, but also this additional pathway which might also increase energy expenditure, which is important, right? You increase some energy expenditure, and that can also help with some of that caloric deficit. But they don't eliminate that kind of that thermostat, that adipostat in your body, right? They work with it. They help to modify or help break that system. So we have some context. We talked about the hormones in the body and the peptides in the body and how those interact from the brain and from the digestive system and from the fat tissue. We touched on a little bit about these medications and how they work. And in essence, to summarize, they help kind of keep the brake system strong while you're in a caloric deficit. That's the best way I can describe it. Please do some research, watch some YouTube videos on it. There's plenty of good ones out there. This isn't the point of this video. This is the point of the video, is this final section. What can we do? What can we do? What are some non-natural strategies or some non-negotiables, right? Whether you're using this medication or not, my advice for anyone out there is you should really be working with your physician, with a dietitian, or with someone, an expert in the field, who can help you work through natural strategies. I think I've seen a lot of people say, well, I've tried everything. And you dig a little deeper and they have never weight trained or consistently exercised. And there may be reasons for that. They may have severe obesity or injuries that contraindicate that. And I'm not talking about those people. I'm talking about general healthy people who basically haven't tried everything. They might have tried the fad diets. They might have tried extreme dieting. They may have tried yo-yo dieting. I've worked with people in the past who, you give them a program, you give them a diet, you ask them to follow it. They get excited because they lose a few pounds in a 3 or 4 weeks, and then they think by ramping up they'll lose a little faster. And so, from our earlier discussion, what does that mean? You're basically kicking into overdrive your gas pedal, right? All of those orexigenic signaling, your body's coming raging back. So they go off program. They try to go extra hard by doubling up cardio or doubling up exercise, and not take a measured approach like they've been kind of given in terms of exercise and nutrition. And then they basically fall off, right? They just can't sustain that. In 3 or 4 weeks of that, usually maybe a couple months, even if it's a phase where they finish, but when they're done and they don't have a plan to go back to maintenance, everything comes rushing back in more, right? And so we want to avoid that, right? You must have a plan in place, to make sure that you are set up for success, whether you choose to use these medications or not. Your hypothalamus is still going to detect, affect changes based on these signals that come to the body, and the effectors are still going to adjust these hunger cues, and increase that hunger signaling to maintain homeostasis, and it's going to do it by any means necessary. So how do we support the brake and calm that gas naturally? So we talked about fiber. Fiber is important. Increases stomach distension, increases that fullness signaling. Protein is important. In fact, that's probably the primary focus in terms of it stimulates satiety peptides in the body, is a higher thermic effect of food compared to carbohydrates and fat especially, so that means it, in essence, takes more to burn it off or to digest it, in essence. Excuse me. And it also supports muscle retention, which is important for metabolism and also, to just the way you look. So protein is key. Protein and fiber, those are two of the critical ones. Having structured meals. We talked about ghrelin earlier. And if you're going long periods of time without eating, especially in a caloric deficit, especially when you are already going to be hungry from not eating as many calories as you normally do, that ghrelin is going to be up. And so one of the things that you can do is help have that structured meal plan in place and prevent those ghrelin spikes from happening, especially if you're dieting and not eating all day long, and then you start binging in the evening. That's probably due to that ghrelin. Stimulus control. You want to reduce as many stimuluses as possible. If you've got junk or foods that you shouldn't be eating in the house, foods that you love to eat, probably not going to want to keep them around, or probably not going to want to put yourself in situations where you eat those foods all the time, at least initially. I am not a big proponent of super restrictive eating in terms of food choices. I mean, I think that there's some strategies that need to be used in terms of eating predominantly whole foods and try to avoid a lot of the processed, quote unquote, packaged foods that are higher in sodium and sugars. But either way, I mean, I think there's still room to include some of those foods, especially when we're talking about adherence. But initially, you probably want to get rid of some of that, or at least reduce your access to that, right? Slowing down food, putting the fork down in between bites, chewing your food, masticating your food, digesting your food. And I have a problem with this personally. So I relate. Sometimes I'm hungry and I'm stressed and I'm not focused and I'm not being mindful and I'm just get this food down and move on to the next task. And so it becomes very task focused for me, right? And that's not always a good thing because then I end up being hungry later. And so I'm trying to work on eating slower, being more mindful while I'm eating. That's a big thing. Remember to help kind of slow down how your stomach is responding to the foods to allow some of those other peptides and hormones to come into play and giving them a chance to catch up with the hunger cues. Resistance training. This is non-negotiable. Resistance training, obviously cardiovascular exercise, aerobic exercise, both together, but resistance training is huge. When we're seeing a lot of folks not engaging in exercise and not really following a structured meal plan, working with a registered dietitian or a nutrition coach who's qualified, they really haven't tried everything, quite frankly, and jumped to the medication. Again, I'm not talking about people who have valid contraindications and they should not exercise, or maybe they're not in a position to exercise. There's still things you can do, especially if you work with a coach that can modify things to fit your lifestyle needs or your conditions. But there's going to be a small group of people that just can't, and maybe this is the pathway for them is really medication and hunger control, diet control. But I think a lot of people don't have a structured plan in place with exercise especially, and that causes a lot of challenges, right? So when you're talking about doing these things, think about putting these things into place so you can have better success. Again, doing these things and putting these habits in place, even if you're taking the medication, it's a very, very important that you think about putting a framework like this in place, even if you need to work with your physician if they're qualified or can point you in the right direction, finding a coach that can do it. You're going to want to make sure that you set yourself up for success, because when you take the medication, you have to think about the long term and not only how you're going to be the most successful on it, but if you come to the point where you lose a bunch of weight and you might consider getting off of that medication, you don't want it to come rushing back. You want to have some of these strategies in place to help give yourself a chance to maintain that weight loss. So we talked about all of those strategies. You still need to eat in a caloric deficit. I'm seeing people take these medications and they're not eating and they're in a caloric deficit just by default, but they really don't have a picture of why or how they're in a caloric deficit. They're just not eating. And so they're relying on that brake system to structure their interactions with food. And I don't know if that's really a healthy approach. I think you have to think about, again, having a diet type plan that's structured for you, that's relevant for your needs, and put that structure in place, because even if you're not hungry, you should still meet your caloric needs, right? Those hormones, that adipostat system is still in place. It's just you're getting a little bit of help putting some brakes on and keeping that gas pedal at bay. And you want to make sure that your diet is structured in a way where you're losing weight, but you're losing weight in a measured way that is sustainable, that you're able to maintain muscle mass and lean mass as well. And so, exercise is a part of that too, because your caloric balance comes with whether you're going to reduce food intake and also increase expenditure through exercise or non-exercise activity, like just walking, extra standing, and that sort of thing. And so you're going to want to make sure that your deficit is appropriate for the amount of weight that you should be losing, which is really modest. You should really be losing about 1 to 2 pounds a week, even on the medication, maybe 3 pounds a week. I know there's some people losing a lot more than that, but I would argue that many of them it's probably just because they're not eating, not necessarily because they're following a structured plan. And if you get stuck and if you're stalled, I think that's important to reevaluate that, because even on the medication, you're going to get stuck at some point. And so the strategy from your physician might be, okay, time to up the medication. And that may be appropriate, but you still need to have a picture of what your diet's doing, what your training is doing, and do you need to drop your calories a little bit? If you're stuck and your appetite control is good, I don't know if I would suggest increasing the medication. I would say take a look at your diet first and make sure that you're eating in a way that now accounts for that weight loss. If you've lost 10 pounds, your caloric needs a month ago or 2 months ago when you were 10 pounds heavier is different than today. And so you need to reevaluate that and adjust that before you increase medication. And that's my point. And I want you to take that information and take that to your discussion with your physician and say, hey, before we jump up, I might need to think about that. Second, non-negotiable, I would say, is there needs to be a plan to return to maintenance. Maintenance calories, beyond the caloric deficit. So you've eaten in this caloric deficit, you've taken this medication, or maybe you haven't. Either way, this applies to both, but you should have a plan. If you have a plan of how much weight you're trying to lose and how much body fat you're trying to lose into a goal that you're trying to get to in a certain amount of time, you should have a plan on how you bring your body back to a maintenance phase. And that means understanding what does that maintenance caloric intake look like, and how do you get there over the course of a few weeks and not just rush back. Now, again, if you're doing this in a way that is pretty extreme, like a short-term 8 to 12 week type of diet that's very aggressive, remember all of those hormones, all of those signals that are coming in, they're going to be very strong. And so the tendency is going to be wanting to eat, right? And you're trying to keep this hunger at bay, and you're doing it through sheer willpower, perhaps, if you're not taking any medication, which is great. My hat's off to you. But that reward system starts to sing, right? Like, hey, we need to eat. You've done a great job. You deserve it, right? And so that's not a joke. And you have to think about how you're going to get back to a maintenance level, how you're going to put back some lean mass if you've lost it, and how you're going to slowly bring that appetite back. And I think that's an important maintenance strategy as well. We talked about exercise, but that's non-negotiable. Whether or not you use, especially if you use this medication, you should be exercising. You should have an exercise plan in place or work with someone who can put one in place for you if you're not sure how to do that. You should have your nutrition structured, and then the medication should be really after all that's said and done. Muscle mass, lean mass is going to support your metabolic rate, your long-term maintenance. Medication is not going to build muscle. In fact, we're seeing a lot of people who are losing a lot of muscle on these types of medications, especially the single agonist receptors, because they're not eating enough calories. Probably they're just not hungry. They're probably not eating enough protein in terms of that, and they're probably not exercising, or they're probably not weight training. That's a triple whammy, and that's just going to lead to them looking very thin. But in terms of body fat levels, in terms of lean mass levels, they're putting themselves at a huge disadvantage. So, strength training for me, exercise, yes, in general, but strength training specifically, that's not negotiable. If you're not doing that, you're doing yourself a huge disservice. You're taking this medication, and it's very expensive medication, and it's really it's kind of a waste, quite frankly. I'm just going to be frank. Lifestyle is important. Medication is a tool that can help, but lifestyle and medication is always going to outperform the medication alone. And so keep that in mind. If that's the one takeaway from this, is that these lifestyle strategies that we're talking about, those trump the medication, in my opinion, for the majority of people. I'm not talking about outliers of people that are really dealing with a severe disease of obesity. But I think that without doing these lifestyles, without also talking about behavioral modifications, and putting those things in place as well, in terms of how your relationship was with food. Because, food could also be reward, but it's also stress relief for a lot of people. And people may have an unhealthy relationship with food to begin with, right? There's eating disorders that we have to think about. And so, if that is a challenge, you might want to consider including that as part of your strategy. Is how do you adjust your behavioral the behavioral relationship that you have with food and eating and hunger, and that's something to think about. And I would not take that lightly. With those strategies in place, I think then you have a lot of things that you can use to your advantage, whether or not you're doing this naturally, especially if you're taking these types of medications, to help kind of have a better relationship with food, a better understanding of how your body reacts to hunger and satiety. Because when you do stop these medications or when you do stop dieting, that hunger is going to come back. And so now you have some information, I think, and I hope that you can use to your advantage. They strengthen the break, these medications do, but your system still needs structure. You still need to be aware of your caloric intake. You need to have a plan for maintenance. You need to be exercising with resistance training. You need to sleep and make sure that you're getting adequate sleep. Sleep is also another big factor that can impact the way we consume calories. Your environment, making sure that you've adjusted your environment to set yourself up for success. All of this fat loss that we're talking about, much of it is biological. The maintenance part of this and how we interact with food, that's more on the behavioral side. And so you really need to think about both, in my opinion. Long-term success is going to require it. If you want to learn more, and I know this has probably been 30, 40 minutes, I don't know, probably talked longer than I meant to, but if you want to learn more, I have a little bit more depth into a guide I'm giving away. And so it's not free, I apologize. It's free in terms of you're not going to have to pay for it, but all I'm asking for is your email address, your contact information, so we can put you on our mailing list. I'm sorry it's a shameless plug, but at least I'm being upfront and not trying to trick you. It's an exchange. You can have this 40-page guide or so, however it is, that puts all of this video into kind of more of a written framework for you. And all I ask is, hey, can you just give me your contact information, and can we keep you up to date with some of the exciting stuff we've got coming, which is the online programming that we're going to be doing, which includes nutrition coaching. So if you read all of this, it makes sense to you, but you're still struggling, you still don't really know how to put these strategies into place, I can help, my team can help. This is the easy part, I'm going to be quite frank. Figuring out a training plan and a diet plan, you could go Google it. You could ask ChatGPT. Just going to be frank with you. But, the coach is where the coaching comes into play, where it's customized. It's really taking into account the human, the person behind it, the situations that you might be dealing with that need to be accounted for and considered in a program. And so, I would say, working with a coach is a great idea, especially if you feel like you struggle with accountability or you need some more guidance on kind of how and when and how to tweak things for your needs. And it's not permanent, right? Like, I think most people have a coach for a few months and they get some results, and our approach has always been educate first. And so, I like to educate and I like to teach people how to do it for themselves, teach a person to fish and they can eat for a lifetime, so to speak. But at the same time, I think that it's an important component. And if you haven't used some of these strategies before and you're stuck, that's why I ask for your email to keep you informed. So I'm going to put the link down in this description of the video or the shorts or wherever we're posting this in terms of the podcast. You can find us on Instagram and you'll have some more access to that. But yeah, I hope this made sense. I hope this was informative. Again, I open it up to anybody that has knowledge about this topic or has exposure to some of these ideas to please do weigh in. Let's crowdsource this information. Let's educate each other. Let's do it respectfully. Welcome the conversation, and we'll look forward to talking to you all in the next one. Thank you all. Thanks for listening to the Next Set podcast and today's episode. If this episode or previous episodes have helped you think or train differently, please share it with someone who needs it. You can find more coaching resources at apextacticalathletics.com. Put that in the description, and you can find us on Instagram at the Next Set Podcast. We'll see you at the next set.